Hey everyone, and welcome back to Investing Talk Podcast. So you want to know about Borr drilling, huh? Ticker symbol BORR. Well, is it a buy or should you steer clear?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, it really is. The company's got like this good news, bad news kind of vibe going on. There's some good signs that the offshore drilling industry is recovering, but Borr itself is facing some financial challenges. And then you look at those stock forecasts and, well, let's just say they're making some investors nervous.
Definitely a bit of a head scratcher.
Okay, so let's break this down, starting with the positives. You mentioned that the offshore drilling industry is showing signs of recovery. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the big thing is that demand for offshore drilling is picking up.
So what does that mean for Borr specifically?
Well, their contracted rig count is up,
Got
which is a good sign that they're benefiting from that increased demand.
Okay, so more rigs under contract, more demand. That sounds pretty positive, right?
Yeah, it is. But there's a little catch, something that investors should definitely keep in mind.
Oh, the
Mm.
catch. What's that?
Well, a lot of these new contracts are for what are called jackup rigs, which are designed for shallow water drilling. And those jackup rigs are in high demand right now because of increased exploration activity in certain areas. The thing is, though, a lot of these contracts are for shorter-term exploration projects.
So even though Borr's getting more contracts, it might not be as stable as it seems.
Right, exactly. It means
Mhm.
they're constantly having to hunt for new contracts, which can make their revenue a little unpredictable.
That's a good point. Makes sense. Now let's shift gears and talk about Borr's earnings. They missed their earnings estimates for Q3 2024, reporting earnings per share of 4 cents, which was lower than the anticipated 9 cents. So how big of a deal is this miss?
Well, anytime a company misses earnings estimates, it's something that investors should pay attention to.
But is it a big red flag or just a minor blip?
Well, in this case, it's especially noteworthy because Borr actually increased their rig utilization during that quarter. So you'd think with more rigs in operation, they'd be more profitable, right?
Yeah, you would.
So the fact that they missed earnings despite having more rigs working raises some questions.
Like what? What kind of questions?
Well, the big question is about cost management. Are their costs rising faster than their revenue?
That's a great point.
Mm,
Because if their costs are going up faster than their income, that could be a real problem.
exactly. And it's something I'll be looking at very closely when the Q4 2024 earnings report comes out on February 19th. We need to see if this cost management issue was just a one-time thing or if it's a trend.
Gotcha. So that Q4 report is going to be pretty important for investors who are trying to decide what to do with BORR.
It definitely is. And we need to pay attention to more than just the earnings themselves.
Like what else?
We need to look at their debt levels, their cash flow, their overall financial health. It's kind of like checking your bank balance.
I like that. A bank balance analogy.
Yeah, one low balance doesn't necessarily mean you're bankrupt, but it's definitely a sign that you need to start watching your spending habits.
Makes total sense. So let's say you were looking at Borr's balance sheet right now. What would be the biggest red flag for you?
Their debt load would be my primary concern.
Okay, why is that?
Well, the offshore drilling industry is very capital intensive,
Yeah.
and Borr has taken on a significant amount of debt to finance its operations. Now, if their revenue and earnings are strong, they can manage that debt. But if those earnings start to weaken, that debt could become a real burden.
And we already talked about those earnings misses.
Right, exactly. That's why this upcoming earnings report is so important. It'll give us a much better picture of whether Borr is on solid financial footing or if they're starting to get a little shaky.
So it's a bit of a wait-and-see situation.
It is, yeah.
All right, well, let's move on and talk about BORR's stock price, which has been all over the place lately. Gov Capital has published some pretty extreme forecasts for the stock. In the short term, like over the next 14 days, they're predicting it could go up almost 5%. But then things take a nosedive.
Yeah, those forecasts are pretty wild.
They really are. Their medium-term forecast, which looks ahead 3 to 6 months, suggests a potential decrease anywhere from almost 16% to over 40%. And their long-term forecast spanning 1 to 5 years predicts a drop between 65 and 74%. Those are some pretty scary numbers, especially for anyone thinking about holding BORR for the long haul.
Yeah, I can see why people would be nervous about those long-term forecasts. They're definitely on the pessimistic side.
So should investors just ignore those forecasts altogether?
I wouldn't say ignore them completely. I think it's good to know what they're saying and what factors they're taking into account.
Like what kind of factors are we talking about?
Well, for example, are they basing their predictions just on historical data? Or are they factoring in things like broader industry trends, potential disruptions, and things like that?
Okay, so what are some red flags that investors should be looking for when they read one of these stock forecasts?
One thing to watch out for is if the forecast relies too heavily on past performance. The offshore drilling industry is cyclical, meaning it goes through booms and busts. So if a forecast is just assuming that the good times are going to keep rolling, it might not be painting a realistic picture.
Okay, so past performance isn't always a reliable indicator of future results.
Exactly. Another thing to consider is whether the forecast is taking into account factors that could disrupt the industry.
Like what? Give us an example.
Well, the transition to renewable energy sources is a big one. If the world is moving away from fossil fuels, that's going to have a huge impact on the offshore drilling industry. And if a forecast isn't taking that into account, it's probably not very accurate.
Okay, so it's not just about looking at numbers. You also have to think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. You got to consider the context.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now let's talk a little bit about the technical indicators for BORR. Currently, the stock is trading below both the 50-day and 200-day moving averages, which are usually seen as bearish signals. What does that mean for investors who are looking at the stock right now?
Well, those moving averages are definitely telling us that the stock has been trending downwards.
So not a great sign.
Not in isolation, no.
No.
But remember, we always want to look at the bigger picture.
Okay, so what else should we be looking at?
Well, if you look at the 14-day Relative Strength Index, or RSI, it's sitting at 31.83 right now. And that suggests that the stock is getting close to what's called oversold territory.
For those of you who might not be familiar with all the technical jargon, can you explain what oversold means and why it's significant?
Sure. In simple terms, an oversold stock is one that has been selling off rapidly and might be due for a bounce back. It doesn't guarantee that the stock is going to go up, but it does suggest that it's gotten relatively cheap compared to its recent trading history. Think of it like a rubber band that's been stretched too far. It's probably going to snap back at some point.
Okay, so it's like the stock is on sale.
In a way, yeah. But the question is whether that snapback is going to be significant or not.
Right, because even if the stock goes up a little bit, it might not be enough to make up for the losses it's already experienced.
Right.
So we've got these long-term bearish signals from those moving averages, but we've also got this potential short-term bullish signal from the RSI. That's a pretty mixed bag, wouldn't you say?
It definitely is. And it's one of the things that makes BORR such an interesting case right now. It's got all the ingredients of a high-risk, high-reward play.
So who would you say is the ideal investor for a stock like this? Is it somebody who's comfortable with a lot of volatility, or is it more for a long-term buy-and-hold investor?
Well, I think it really depends on your individual investment style and risk tolerance.
So if you're someone who doesn't mind a little bit of risk, and you think you can time the market, BORR might be worth considering as a short-term trade.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But if you're more of a long-term investor who's looking for stability and predictability, I'd say there are probably better options out there.
Makes sense. It sounds like BORR is a stock that requires a lot of research and careful consideration. There are some potential upsides, but there are also some real risks.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to do your due diligence, understand the company, understand the industry, and know what your own investment goals are before you make any decisions.
Well said. And speaking of due diligence, we have some news for our listeners who are following BORR closely.
Yes. Mark your calendars for February 19th, 2025, because that's when Borr Drilling will be releasing their Q4 2024 earnings report.
And this report is going to give us a lot more information about Borr's performance, their financial health, and maybe even some clues about their future plans.
And for those who want to dive even deeper, Borr Drilling will be hosting a conference call on February 20th, 2025 to talk about the earnings report in more detail.
So during this call, investors will be able to hear directly from Borr's management team, ask questions, and really get a feel for the company's strategy.
It's a great opportunity to get some real insights.
So if you're seriously thinking about investing in BORR, we highly recommend tuning in to that conference call.
Definitely. It's a chance to gather some really valuable information and get a better sense of the company's leadership team.
Okay, we'll be right back after this short break with some final thoughts on Borr Drilling. Stay tuned. Okay, so it's like the stock is on sale.
In a way, yeah. But the question is whether that snapback is going to be as significant or not.
Right, because even if the stock goes up a little bit, it might not be enough to make up for the losses it's already experienced.
Exactly.
So we've got these long-term bearish signals from those moving averages, but we've also got this potential short-term bullish signal from the RSI. That's a pretty mixed bag, wouldn't you say?
It definitely is. And it's one of the things that makes BORR such an interesting case right now. It's got all the ingredients of a high-risk, high-reward play.
So who would you say is the ideal investor for a stock like this? Is it somebody who's comfortable with a lot of volatility, or is it more for a long-term buy and hold investor?
Well, I think it really depends on your individual investment style and risk tolerance.
So if you're someone who doesn't mind a little bit of risk and you think you can time the market, BORR might be worth considering as a short-term trade.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But if you're more of a long-term investor who's looking for stability and predictability, I'd say there are probably better options out there.
Makes sense. It sounds like BORR is a stock that requires a lot of research and careful consideration. There are some potential upsides, but there are also some real risks.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to do your due diligence. Understand the company, understand the industry, and know what your own investment goals are before you make any decisions.
Well said. And speaking of due diligence, we have some news for our listeners who are following BORR closely.
Yes. Mark your calendars for February 19th, 2025, because that's when Borr Drilling will be releasing their Q4 2024 earnings report.
And this report is going to give us a lot more information about Borr's performance, their financial health, and maybe even some clues about their future plans.
And for those who want to dive even deeper, Borr Drilling will be hosting a conference call on February 20th, 2025, to talk about the earnings report in more detail.
So during this call, investors will be able to hear directly from Borr's management team, ask questions, and really get a feel for the company's strategy.
It's a great opportunity to get some real insights.
So if you're seriously thinking about investing in BORR, we highly recommend tuning into that conference call.
Definitely. It's a chance to gather some really valuable information and get a better sense of the company's leadership team.
And we've got those dates for you again, February 19th for the earnings report and February 20th for the conference call.
Right. Definitely worth checking out if you're interested in BORR.
So it sounds like this Q4 report and the following conference call are going to be pretty crucial events for anyone who's watching this stock.
They definitely are. It'll give us a much clearer picture of Borr's financial situation and where they might be headed in the future.
All right, well, we'll be sure to keep our listeners updated on those developments.
Okay, sounds good.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the bigger picture here. We've been focused on Borr drilling specifically, but what about the offshore drilling industry as a whole? Where do you see things headed in the next few years?
Well, it's definitely an industry that's facing some challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, the biggest one is the transition to renewable energy. As the world moves towards cleaner sources of energy, the demand for fossil fuels is likely to decline. And that's obviously going to have an impact on the offshore drilling industry.
But isn't there still a lot of demand for oil and gas?
There is. But that demand is not going to last forever. And companies like Borr are going to have to adapt if they want to survive in the long run.
So what does that adaptation look like?
Well, for some companies, it might mean diversifying their operations, moving into new areas like offshore wind energy or carbon capture and storage.
So it's about finding new ways to use their expertise and technology in a changing world.
Right, exactly. It's about evolving with the times.
So it's not all doom and gloom for the offshore drilling industry. There are opportunities out there for companies that are willing to innovate and adapt.
Absolutely. And I think the companies that are able to make that transition successfully are going to be the ones that thrive in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you're an investor who's looking at the offshore drilling industry, it's important to consider not just the current market conditions, but also the long-term trends and the potential for disruption.
Definitely. You got to think about the big picture and where the industry is headed.
Great advice. Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. We've learned a lot about Borr drilling, the offshore drilling industry, and the importance of doing your research before making any investment decisions.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, we hope you found this conversation helpful and informative. Be sure to subscribe to Investing Talk Podcast. Share this episode with your fellow investors and leave us a comment with your thoughts on Borr drilling. We always love to hear from you. Until next time, happy investing. And we're back with Investing Talk Podcast. We've been talking all about Borr drilling, ticker symbol BORR, and trying to figure out if it's a good investment or not.
We have covered a lot of ground. A lot.
We really have. We talked about the recovering offshore drilling industry. Borr's increasing rig count, those short-term contracts that are making some investors nervous, the recent earnings miss, those wild stock forecasts, and of course the upcoming Q4 earnings report. So for our listeners who are still on the fence about BORR, what are the key takeaways? What should they be thinking about?
I think the most important thing is to keep a level head. Don't let emotions get in the way of your investment decisions.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype or the fear, especially with a stock like BORR where the forecasts are so unpredictable.
Right, exactly. Take your time, do your research, weigh the risks and the potential rewards, and then make a decision that's right for you. A decision that aligns with your investment goals and your risk tolerance.
That's good advice for any investment, really. Not just BORR.
It is. And another thing to keep in mind is that investing is a long game.
So don't freak out if BORR's stock price goes up or down in the short term.
Exactly. Try to focus on the long-term trends and the company's fundamentals. Is the company well managed? Do they have a solid strategy? Are they in a growing industry? Those are the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself.
And if you're not sure how to answer those questions,
That's where research comes in. Read industry reports, listen to earnings calls, talk to analysts, and never stop learning. The investment landscape is constantly changing. You got to stay curious and be willing to adapt.
okay, so do your research, manage your emotions, focus on the long term. Any other words of wisdom for our listeners who are considering BORR?
I think the big question you need to ask yourself is this: what kind of investor are you? Are you comfortable with high risk and potentially high reward? Or are you looking for something a bit more stable and predictable? Because Borr Drilling is not for the faint of heart. It's a company with a lot of potential, but it also has its fair share of risks.
So if you're someone who enjoys a little bit of risk, you do your research, and you believe in the long-term potential of the offshore drilling industry, then BORR might be worth a look.
But if you're looking for a safe and steady investment, there are probably better options out there.
Great insights. Thanks for breaking all this down for us.
My pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, we hope you enjoyed this conversation about Borr drilling. Don't forget to subscribe to Investing Talk Podcast, share this episode with your friends, and leave us a comment with your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy investing.